Hi guys, welcome to today's video. Today we'll be talking about what 3 questions I think you should ask yourself if you're buying your first 3D printer in 2025. So let's get into it. Alright, I think the first question to ask yourself is, what do I want to print? I know this seems like a very basic question, but it'll lead you down the route of FDM versus resin. If you really want to print miniatures or small pieces of terrain, resin is going to be the way to go. It's going to give you high detailed but brittle pieces. You can have limited material options, some color options, which we'll discuss, but it's going to be basically for non-functional pieces. If you're looking to print anything either large or functional, then you want to go the FDM route. You're going to have a much broader range of materials. You're going to have much bigger size options. It's going to give you a lot more flexibility of what you want to print. It's not going to be as great if you also want to print miniatures, but there are ways to do it, which I've included some other videos about printing with a 0.2 millimeter nozzle. But basically, the FDM is going to be much more versatile of props, you know, things like this, helmets, oven knobs. That's where FDM is going to really come into play. So I think you need to ask that question and kind of look at what direction that sends you down for different printers.
With FDM printers, there's a huge variety of both filaments and colors that you can print. This is just quick search on Amazon. PLA is probably the most common printing material with FDM. It's a fairly rigid plastic, but fairly inexpensive. This is for a whole bundle, $73. Usually it's $10 to $30 a roll, but again, huge variety of colors. You've got glow in the dark. You've got multicolor where the color changes as it prints. You've got dual and tricolor extrusion where essentially, left side of the print is blue and the right side of the print might be green or red. There's a whole variety of different filaments you can print. And that's just PLA. There's also a TPU, which is a 95 durometer, so it's a much softer material if you want to print something that's flexible. This is where I mentioned a car tire, not a car tire, but a car tire for like a remote control car or remote control vehicle, things like that. And then there's even more. There's with certain printers you can print nylon. PETG is a more robust material. Again, there's just many more varieties. Wood style filaments. There's just with FDM, it can just handle this variety of filaments that resin just cannot. So again, if you're looking for more flexibility in what you can print, FDM is certainly the way to go. So I just pulled up some resins on Amazon. So these are 3D printed resin materials. So we talked a little bit about FDM materials, but as far as what you can print with resin, it's mostly going to be miniatures or something that's highly detailed and non-functional. So most of your options when it comes to resin materials is going to be around color, opacity. There is some degree of flexible resins that you can test. They're still, I think, very limited in what they can do. But there's different hardness, brittleness, but again, for the most part, they're going to be non-functional materials. So like an oven knob or a tire, that's not something that you're going to be able to print on a resin printer. So if your goals have a functional part, you're going to go towards the FDM route. Whereas if you want something, again, delicate, decorative, that's when you're going to want to go to a resin printer.
The second question to ask yourself is, what size do I want to print? Now in resin, this really comes into how many pieces can you print at once, but there are still some limitations for how big of pieces you can print. On FDM, your typical bed size is this, roughly 8 inches by 8 inches or 250 millimeters square. Now you can still print some pretty large pieces just with this. For example, this prop axe that I have was broken up into basically 4 different sections, axe head, and then each of these little pieces, and then glued together. So you can certainly get creative even with a small bed size. But if you're looking to print something larger, like this Dr. Fate helmet I printed, then you're going to want a larger helmet size printer, which will be larger than what your typical printer is. So that's something to keep in mind if you have particular things you're looking to print and how big you want to print. Then size will be, I think, a significant contributing factor. We're going to get into the resin printing size features in a little bit more detail here.
So we think a lot of print size with FDM, but it does also affect resin printers as well. So this is my Mars 4 bed size. I've got 5 Space Marine models up here, specifically Thousand Suns. I've oriented these pretty vertically to show trying to squeeze a lot of models on here is really difficult. It's just such a small bed size that if you're trying to print armies, it can certainly take a lot of runs. Now, this is only going to estimate, take a little over 2 hours, but I'm going to have to pry these models off, you know, do a wash and then do a cure to get these finished. So it's going to take multiple runs to get this done. Whereas if I had something larger, it would take less runs. So, keep in mind what you want to use for the printer, because I think with a lot of resin printers, it's just that it's going through those multiple stages that people really get bogged down with resin print. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, I could probably maybe squeeze a couple more on here if I got creative, but there just is a limit, and you'll have to get creative with larger models on how you want to fit them on here. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking at different printers.
All right, and then the third question is budget, of course. How much do you want to spend on this printer? You can really spend a lot of money on a printer, and then I've seen people get frustrated with it, and it feels like it's money gone down the drain. So personally, I don't recommend spending a lot of money, but let's take a look at what you can get for different price points here.
I'm sure this is going to be a controversial slide here, but this is my recommendation chart of 3D printers. Starter 3D printers, basically from cheapest on the left to more expensive on the right. This is broken out into 3 different color codings. You've got your traditional bed slinger in black, you've got your Core XY in red, and then what I'm calling your helmet size printers in blue. Now, real quick, for those who aren't familiar, bed slingers are your more traditional printers where you've got a XY gantry that moves up and down, and then your entire bed moves, shifting the whole print. These usually took some setup, but these are much more plug and play now, not completely plug and play, but much easier to get up and running even now. The red printers, the Core XYs, these are enclosed printers, and these have beds that do not move, but rather have all 3 axes that move over the bed instead of having the bed move. And then these are traditionally very plug and play, where basically you unbox the printer, plug it in, and it's ready to go. And then the blue ones are what I just called big enough to be able to print kind of a helmet in one print, so over a 250 millimeter bed size. Now, again, this list is not exhaustive. These prices are subject to change, so I would take all this with a grain of salt. But I've got at your low end, the Ender 3 SE. This to me covers the very minimums you want in a 3D printer, where it's got dual Z screws, you've got a auto bed level feature, and you've got direct drive. I used to recommend the Ender 3s, but to me the Ender 3s require obviously much more setup and certainly are kind of obsolete at this point. So I would recommend the Ender 3 SE if you're really trying to go with the cheapest, most basic printer that you can. I've got one I got off Amazon for I think $180. I've loved it. I've not had any issues with it, so definitely a recommend. I've got the Crealities up here up top, and then Anycubic, and then a Flash Forge. So I try to break this out by kind of the main 3D printer suppliers here. Again, the advantage of a name brand is there are more support groups for things like this on Facebook or Reddit. If someone's had an issue, or if you have an issue, there's a chance someone else has had it. And also just finding parts is much easier. Kind of the cheapest Core XY that I could find was the Flash Forward Adventure. These are used at my work a lot, actually, for many of our plants. They're enclosed, plug and play, pretty easy to use. They've run really well, so don't have any complaints about that one. Again, that's the cheapest. I found one $250 on Amazon. That might have been a sale price. And again, with tariffs, I don't know how these prices will change in the future. These Cobras, this is also another Anycubic line, but these are a larger printer. And then your Bamboos, which are very popular right now. One thing to call out on the Bamboos is that you do use the Bamboo software. It's an online printer, so if that's not something you're interested in, you can go with, I think, any of these other options are very feasible. And then the Pressa Mini is a popular printer. The price is a lot higher, but again, it's been very popular printer for many years. So I didn't hit up any of the higher printers. There's definitely more options from all these same suppliers, but I try to keep this relatively cheap, under $700 with these higher end ones here. And again, this list, there's other printers out there that your friends or family or other coworkers might have that maybe they love. So again, this list isn't exhaustive. Just because you don't see the printer you want to get on here doesn't mean it's a bad idea. This is just ones I've been familiar with and trying to give you the scope of what you get for your price increase. If you're bare bones, you'll get a bed slinger. If you want to spend more, you're going to get a larger bed size, Core XY, a lot more features. So it's just personal preference. And again, go back to the three questions of what size, what's your budget, and then what else, what do you want to print with these printers is kind of what comes into play and how you make a decision from under $200 printer to a $700 printer. So, all right, I almost didn't make a chart for the resin printers. As you can see, this is a not very clear system. And the reason is because a lot of these printers have a much broader range of options versus your FDM printers. So I think the Anycubic printers up here at the top are probably the most clear, but even that, the Saturn IV will span multiple $100s. So how Anycubic does it is basically planet size, right? You've got Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, bigger as you go up. But their Saturn, they've got multiple different options with. And this is true about all these, is depending on what options you want to get, your price will increase. So your bare bones Saturn is just going to be basically similar to the Mars, but with a bigger bed size. However, there's a Saturn with better resolution. So you're talking 8K or 12K. And then some of them have a heated vat. Some of them have a option where the bed will tilt to allow you to get the models off easier. And that's true on all these printers. So really, this, whether it's the Anycubic, or sorry, the Elegoo, Anycubic, all these printer options I've heard good things about or had good experience with myself. So it's hard to go, I think, wrong with resin printers. I don't think, in my personal experience, that you need heated vats. You don't need to get the latest and greatest 12K. You're going to get good prints off of 6K or anything, even a 4K. I think you're going to be very satisfied with the models off of that. It's just at a certain point, how many features do you want on it? And if you're starting off, I would definitely lean more towards the lower side. I don't want someone to spend $400 or $500 and then really hate the resin process. This also doesn't include a wash and cure station or any resin. So keep in mind you're going to be adding roughly $100 to this with your wash and cure station. All right, I figured this would be a good way to kind of show how resin printer prices can be a little bit misleading up front. So if your budget is $200, you can say, hey, look, I can get a Mars 4. Again, this is what I purchased one of these last year. Great price, under $200. I can start churning out miniatures and be on my way. Which unfortunately with this is not exactly true, because you can kind of see down here with these bundles, and I do recommend a wash and cure station, but you're a little under $200 for the printer, but then your first resin is going to be $20, $30. That's, I'd say, as expected. But then if you're doing a wash and cure station, you're probably out another $100 for that. So quickly your now budget is over budget by $100 here of your original budget, $200. So something to keep in mind. And then this is just to get you a finished print. Another thing to be concerned about is, how are you storing this? There's harmful vapors that come off these printers. I built myself a box with a separate fan for ventilation, so I probably spent easy another $100 building that box and, making sure it's all sealed up and vents outside. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, that the resin printers is just a lot more involved than just this initial base price. So definitely keep that in mind when you're shopping around. It's just not apparent unless you kind of know what's all involved in resin printing.
In addition to those three main questions, I think there are a couple other things you want to think about before getting into 3D printing. Something like with resin, there are health hazards and fumes you have to deal with. So if that's not something you want to deal with or are concerned with pets or family members or anything else like with that, I would avoid resin. FDMs can be much more friendly in that regards. Other things when buying your printer, I do recommend name brands, not for any brand loyalty, just because of part availability and support groups. Those are much more readily available for name brand printers. And then one thing I didn't discuss in this is multicolor printing. Personally, I think it's been a bit of a fad, and there's limited files you can use. But if you're really wanting to print multicolor prints, make sure you get a printer that is compatible with that, even if you don't buy a multicolor unit up front. Anyway, that does it for today's video. Thanks for joining. If you, please like and subscribe for more. Thanks.